Friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People. Coach Eric here, coach of Autonomy Debate. I want to talk a little bit about some debate stuff. I was thinking about it out on the patio when I was smoking a cigarette. We're at the Kronberg Inn in Solvang. We have to vacate our house for a week so that the real estate people can do stuff with it. But anyway, so my basic thesis here is that in most disputed policy matters of some sort, any kind of policy matter, the way that the debates should operate is that the AF should be prescriptive and the neg should be normative. For those who aren't debaters, prescriptive and normative simply refer to things that are justified because of interest is prescriptive. Things that are legitimate, regardless of interest, are normative. So, one of the things that I was considering is that for the AF, inherency should include establishing legitimacy. To say that something has inherency means that a problem exists in the status quo, there are barriers to solving the problem, and your advocacy solves those, your advocacy solves those barriers, basically. So, for example, if the problem in the status quo is that a certain company that produces potatoes is selling potatoes that make people sick, let's say. And let's say that there's no law that prevents them from doing so, or there's no way for anybody to remedy their harms, right? So then the fact that there's no way for them to remedy their harms is a barrier to solving the problem in the status quo. So then legislation proposed would bypass that barrier. But inherency is normally understood to be simply that the problem exists, it won't solve itself, and your advocacy solves it, right? But basically, inherency is that the problem exists in the status quo and it won't solve itself, so we have to do something. The thing is, inherency should also include legitimacy, in my opinion. So you don't have inherency for your advocacy, really, unless you also have jurisdictional legitimacy. So the AF in any form of debate should need to establish inherency. Inherency has kind of fallen by the wayside in contemporary policy debate, for example. Most cases don't even bother establishing it. The stock issues are the shits: solvency, harms, inherency, topicality, and significance. So, for an advocacy to successfully convince anybody that the action proposed ought to be done, the AF should have to establish inherency, that the problem exists in the status quo and won't solve itself. It should have to address the harms. So every advocacy doesn't just have benefits, it has some harms too, or costs, right? They've got to be topical. Now that's specific to a debate round, right? Where you have a clear resolution or a plan. A resolution is like a statement that the AF says we ought to assert, we all ought to agree that it's true. And then a plan is, say, an actual advocacy that we should pass this legislation that does this thing, right? So then the other one, significance, just says, even if you do provide some solvency for a problem that's inherent in the status quo, and the solvency outweighs the harms, and it's topical, if it does just a teeny little bit of impacts, then we ought not do it, because now that we're all in agreement that this problem exists in the status quo and needs to be addressed, then we could find a plan that has significance, right? Rather than just in debate, significance basically prevents people from making tiny advocacies. Okay, so that's what every app should have to present. It should have to establish to win a round. Well, the last one is solvency. So solvency is you have to establish that what you're proposing will actually solve the problem. We can throw money at something and not solve a problem. People do it all the time. Just look at, say, um, what's a good example? Like sports teams sometimes throw all kinds of money at free agents and it just doesn't work, right? So I can't think of a good example right now. But now let's talk about the neg. So while the app should have to establish all that, in inherency, they should have to establish normative legitimacy. Not just that it's morally acceptable, but that it's jurisdictionally correct. That you've got the right agent doing the action, and it conforms to the rule of law and other like civic norms, you know. So in contrast, then, well, once you've done that, once you've established that you have legitimacy, your job then is to establish that it's prescriptively desirable. Yes, it's legitimate across the board, and now I'm going to establish impacts that show that, in fact, we have to do it for prescriptive reasons, that it's beneficial to us. Now, on the neg side, all negs should be running normative negations first and foremost, because that's the hardest thing for the AF to defend. It's easy to propose that we do something. It's hard to propose that we do something that's entirely legitimate jurisdictionally and morally, especially if you're trying to solve problems internationally. A lot of parties will say, well, we need to bomb those people or whatever, you know. So that in that case, they need to conform to the norms of just war theory, basically. But anyway, instead, what you have in debate rounds is the neg trying to beat AF all the time and build up a bunch of terminal impacts. If you don't negate, all these terrible things are going to happen. Well, the thing is, you should only be able to meaningfully establish that kind of negation if, in fact, what's being proposed, you have good legitimate reason to believe that it's actually going to create all these huge impacts. And the neg often in contemporary debate doesn't even really address the AF. They run counter plans. So they say, no, don't do what the AF says, do what we say. But that's not the job of the negation, right? For you to be wrong, I don't have to be right. So, for example, with evolution. Evolution's bullshit. So is creationism. And they're bullshit because neither of them are explanations for where species come from. They fail to meet the basic burden of the AF to affirm. They fail to establish that their explanation meaningfully provides knowledge to us that we can use in any way, shape, or form for anything. If we test evolution, it always fails. So the thing is, a lot of people say, well, of course evolution, because it's the best explanation there is anyway. No, it's not. It's not an explanation at all. It fails on every level, okay? But the thing is, I don't know what the correct explanation is. That doesn't stop you from being wrong. And the neg needs to remember that. The neg's job is not to say what's correct. It's to explain why the AF's wrong. So, if I were to get back into debate coaching seriously, what I would do with my squad is try to upend the status quo in debate. And the status quo, and especially in policy debate, is all about impacts and plans and counterplans on both sides. So if I'm AF, I'm going to run some kind of critique on the neg saying, you're not doing your job. You don't have fiat, and your counterplan, even if we negate, will not be enacted because you don't have fiat because you're not the AF. And okay, here's another thing that makes me mad about debate sometimes. Affirmative Ks. You cannot run a K in your freaking 1AC. It makes no sense at all. What are you critiquing? Are you critiquing the topic area? Are you critiquing your own plan text? You can't possibly be critiquing anything the NEG's doing because they haven't even spoken yet. So, AFKs are bullshit. Completely bullshit. You should not be able to affirm anything with a critique. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's not an advocacy. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.